What macronutrient composition is optimal for cycling? I currently do a high starch vegan diet and my macros are 75% carbs, 15% fat, and 10% protein. I eat around 3,500 calories a day and do 36-hour fasts some weeks. I'm just wondering if increasing my fat intake will be good or bad, but I kind of panic while eating sunflower seeds because they have a lot of fat. So not having to worry about that would be fantastic. Thanks, from Jonathan.
Can I take this one?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nate.
Okay. So in this question, this is a great question. Jonathan, you didn't put your weight. So we're going to assume a 72 kilogram male because that makes my math easy. So in that situation, at the 15 or 10% protein, that's around 87.5 grams of protein that you're taking per day, around 656 grams of carbs and 85 grams of fat. Okay. That's with this macro breakdown at 3,500 calories. Now, when you think about it, or based on research for aerobic endurance athletes, the amount of protein that is recommended is between 1.2 and 1.4 grams per kilogram of protein per day. We're going to talk a second about vegans because that changes it a little bit, but that's in general like a healthy amount of protein. So that 87.5 is exactly a 1.2 ratio for Jonathan. So if that's it, your protein is probably pretty solid, but the vegan thing throws in a wrench, which Pete's going to cover in a second. The next part, let's talk about fat. There is a minimum level of fat that you need per day in order to be a good, like have healthy hormones, all that good stuff to be able to be a good athlete. The 85 grams of fat is probably enough. You might increase that too with more training. I wouldn't really worry about it, especially as you go more training. So eat your sunflower seeds. The carbs are going to be really important. And at 75% of carbs, that's really big. 656 studies show that endurance athletes need 6 to 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight per day. That's going to be different based on how much you're training. What they have seen is over 10 grams of kilograms per carbohydrate, even if you're doing tons and tons of training, does not improve performance. So there's no reason to go over that 10 grams that we know today. So the way that I like to look at it is you get your protein intake, which maybe for Jonathan will be 1.2 to 1.4. You get your fat, a minimum 85%, and then the rest are carbs. And as your training goes up, you can fill that with carbs. And a lot of that will be naturally filled with carbs just based on the amount of carbs you would drink on the bike. But also as it goes up, you see the Tour de France riders and they have an incredible amount of protein. And this, you might think, wow, that means I need to eat an incredible amount of protein. But you try to eat over 21 days when they're eating like 8,000 calories a day and had like, you can't pick foods unless you eat pure fruit that don't get your protein super duper high. So with the amount of carbs that they're eating, just everything, even oatmeal has protein. I can't think of anything else. Pasta has protein. Like all the things that they would regularly eat has protein, and it just naturally comes up. And that's it. So you're probably, Jonathan, really good in here. For people that are trying to do this, measuring your food like this, I know Alex Wild does it, but it is a certain type of personality. And even I'm fairly detail oriented and like to measure stuff, but I can only do this for a while before I lose it. But I recommend if you want to optimize something and you want to improve, do this for a week. And my biggest insight was, wow, there is a lot of fat in everything. And my fat intake was actually like 30%. And my carb intake was not as high as I thought it was, even though I thought my carb intake was really high. And that just opens your eyes to stuff. Another thing that we're assuming in this question is that Jonathan is of healthy body weight and is not trying to lose or gain weight. Okay, so that's really important because that's a totally different question. Pete, before you I want to say one thing too about calorie restriction and weight loss before we get to your part. This is really cool. And we've mentioned this before, but I pulled the study for this question. There was a 2016 study of 40 young men, and they did high intensity training. So like interval training, 6 days a week, plus resistance training during a severe calorie restriction diet. So meaning they burned more calories than they ate each day. And they had them in 2 different groups, one at 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day, and one at 2.4. So double the amount. And this is really interesting. What happens is when you are in a caloric deficit and you get your protein levels up around 2.0, this is the highest I've seen at 2.4, but usually 2.0 to 2.2. This one, I think they just doubled it to get probably enough effect. The lean body mass, so both groups lost weight, but the group that had them double the protein had 2.4 more pounds of lean mass and 2.8 less pounds of fat. So you lose the same amount, but you keep the muscle and you lose the fat, which I think we all really like. If you're if you're a bodybuilder and you're not an athlete, it's usually 2.8 to 2 grams per kilogram is like a normal for weightlifting to build muscle. So if you are trying to do a caloric deficit and trying to lose weight, it makes sense to increase your protein intake. Know though that something else is going to give, especially in a caloric restriction, where if you're doing like sweet spot or something, your intervals can be hard. And hopefully you can save those carbs to right before and during the workout, so you can get a really good workout and then restrict it in other places. One other, I should have pulled up a study, but another one about weight loss is the amount of you sleep when you're caloric deficit. It was very similar to this results where I think they had people sleeping 9 hours or like 5 hours. And the group that slept 5, they both lost the same amount of weight, but the group that slept 5 hours, it was almost all muscle. And the group that slept a bunch, it was a good mix where they lost a little bit of muscle, but more fat. So if you want to do this wrong and you're in a severe caloric deficit, don't sleep a lot and have low protein intake. Then all you'll do is lose muscle. Your basal metabolic rate will go down, meaning you'll burn less calories naturally during the day. It's like kind of pointless, I think. Not fun. Yeah. Pete, so we're talking about vegans. You have a degree in nutrition. The vegan diet, there's some things that people have to think about.
Yeah, and thank you for setting all those good baselines. Like everything Nate just said is absolutely perfect. It's something that everybody should be thinking about, even if you're not the type of person that measures. Just like Nate said, if you measure for 1 week, it will flip a switch in your brain and you'll never think about food the same way or the same food the same way. And it's crazy to actually measure what you're eating and see how it's affecting you and see what's in there. So one of the kind of interesting things is since we're focusing on protein, relatively speaking, plant-based proteins are lower absorption rates than animal-based proteins. And they all vary. And so I was going to start regurgitating some, but there's some kind of baselines that you can think about. Generally speaking, beans are kind of lower on the absorption rate. Kind of simpler like rice and pea are higher. Even wheat's pretty high. But one of the things that's really important or the most important is that you're getting kind of adequate protein throughout the day. And I think this is kind of a problem that we have based on our eating habits that are acceptable in the world right now. We have kind of lighter breakfasts, medium lunches, heavy dinners. And what you can kind of do is look back on your day and make sure that you're getting, for Jonathan and his 72 kilograms of weight, like 20 to 40 grams of protein per day or per meal in each meal per day, and making sure those meals are adequately spaced. We always talk about the post-workout window, and I was reading some studies for this, and almost over and over and over, it's the post-workout window is important and is valuable for most people, but it's much less so if you're adequately fueling throughout the day. So you can kind of stack the odds in your favor of being more recovered and more ready for work by adequately fueling each meal in a normally spaced time per day. So one of the last things is when you are plant-based, or if you have any sort of dietary restriction at all, it's more important to try to find different sources of protein. All the essential amino acid profiles vary. So depending on what you are restricting or what you like to eat, kind of most plant-based protein supplements that you buy now are always combinations of multiple sources, and that gets a complete amino acid profile. So I think it's hard to buy a bad one nowadays, but I wouldn't put it past anybody to sell one that's not complete. So it's just as important to look at your sources, and it's pretty easy to check the amino acid profiles. And there's a lot of information online about kind of which play nicely together. Like rice and pea gets you a complete amino acid profile. And there's lots of studies that if you adequately, if your intake is adequate, and for vegan, with the lower absorption rates, you kind of bump it up. So like Nate said, 20% seems to be a pretty happy rule, that if you're doing all plant-based based on absorption, you're going to get less actually into your system. So bump up your 1.2 to 1.4 by 20%. So 1.32 to 1.68, or what? I don't know if that math is exactly right, but it's just all these things where you stack the odds in your favor. You're getting a complete amino acid profile. You're doing slightly more protein. You're spacing it out accordingly. And the last really important thing, when we had our podcast with Jesse, we kept talking about variety and how you get so much more nutritional benefit from a variety of food. And this is a perfect example of, if you find a protein that works for you, it's really hard not to just stick with that one thing. And so even at home, I try not to do protein shakes that often, and I use 2 different ones, so that even if I have 4 protein shakes a week, I'm actually only doing 2 different sourced ones. But I always try to do as many different protein sources, whether that's legumes or tofu or tempeh or, plain old black beans. Every kind of real vegetable has a lot of protein also. Like Brussels sprouts are pretty protein heavy, things like that. So you don't think of it as a pure protein source. Look at it, the total protein intake from your entire meal. And you'd be surprised, like if you eat 5 cups of spinach or something, which if you cook that down is like, that much, it's like 15 grams of protein. So you're still getting adequate protein intake from a bunch of different things. And that's going to get you to those levels over and over, meal by meal, and make you feel better overall. And that's how you get complete amino acid profiles too. Then you don't even have to worry. If you're always varying your protein sources and each meal has multiple sources that are contributing, you'll always get complete amino acid, or I shouldn't say that, but most likely get complete
Bettering your
amino acid
chances.
profiles. Yes.
There's 2 points that come up to me on this one. Number one, we are very good at compartmentalizing our plates, because that's kind of how we've been raised, in the sense that we think of things in terms of the food groups, and we want to put something so badly into one bucket and then everything else into different buckets. But the fact is, especially if we're trying to eat whole foods that are plants in particular, they have a rich background. It's not just like they're stuck into one lane with all that stuff. So that's like a really good point. Then number 2, it is really hard to eat a variety a lot of the time, especially when you start measuring food. I don't know if you've had this experience, everybody here, but once you start measuring your food, you suddenly start to realize how hard it is to actually kind of hit your marks, so to speak. So you look for recipes and you find one, and then you tend to latch onto that because it tasted good and it was easy to hit your marks. And that's like a big temptation, because then you just fall into a routine where you're just eating the same thing over and over. And while that may be better than what you were eating before, it's not just black and white here. There's a very broad spectrum between improvement here. It's still like variety, I feel like, is such a key. And I've noticed that I feel really good when I'm making sure that I'm eating a variety. And it's not just like, it's not like I have a boost in FTP. It's not like I have anything like that. Just all things in life just seem to be a bit easier. My body seems to just work a bit better. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you've kind of like found your one food and latched onto it, don't feel bad. It's probably better than where you were. So that's a really good step. But try to find different ways to broaden that spectrum and to reach out from that for sure.
That's why we, on this podcast, we recommend the endurance diet, because this measurement and like that stuff will drive you crazy, where it has principles and it says, eat carb centric, eat enough, eat a variety, eat everything. I think that's how he puts it. And if you live your life by that, you eat till you're full, but not stuffed. And then you eat a whole bunch of foods and you eat carb centric, you're probably going to be okay. That 1 week of of measuring is you think a Cinnabon is a carb meal when actually it has 89 grams of fat, right? Or I should look it up, but it has a ton of fat, and you don't realize that, and then you're like, wow, that's the whole day. So not mean to say you can never eat that. You can fit it in on certain days, but you probably don't want it every day for breakfast if you have a goal of 15% fat per day. And if the whole, I'm never eating this food for the rest of my life, I don't like that idea. I had Popeyes for the first time in 2020, just a couple of days ago, and it was amazing. And I'm done for the year. But it's just like give yourself a little bit of, how Amber always says, give yourself a little bit of slack. It's actually, I think you will perform worse trying to live on the edge and measure everything than to follow some basic principles and give yourself slack. It's just like descending we talked about. You descend on that edge, you're going to binge on Popeyes for a week one day. I think it's all probably happened to us where we do a diet and then we end up going to fast food for like 2 weeks in a row because the diet is so bad. Water was another thing. I'm just going to just say what Amber says instead of letting her talk. Water cutting through rocks and stone. She talks about that for fitness. Same thing for weight loss. Everyone wants this like quick weight loss. Like, I lost 10 pounds in a week. Well, it's all glycogen and water weight. That's why you lost it, because you didn't do any carbs. So it didn't really mean anything. But they don't think about it over many, many months, sustainable.
And not only that, but talking about water cutting stone, it's also, you need to give yourself time to improve your eating habits too. Not just the outcome in terms of body composition, if that's your goal, which what we're talking about here, that's not really the goal, right? It isn't to lose weight. Ideally, your body composition or your change in nutrition and everything else should be to basically improve health. And if health improves, performance is likely going to improve as well. But with that in mind, be patient with yourself. It's going to take a long time for you to be able to make this sort of adjustments to your diet. And I shouldn't say diet, but to your nutrition, because that's a more broad term there. It's going to take a lot of time. Like, it's not easy just to make those changes one day to the next.
Yeah, what you're trying to do is build new habits. And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time and patience and effort. But then on the other side of it, you've established these new habits that now take a lot less effort, a lot less decision-making, a lot less emotional and cognitive load. So think of it as a process of building new habits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's a pursuit. Like, lastly, you never get perfection. You're always sliding somewhere along the scale. So think of it as you're better than you were a week ago or a month ago or a year ago. And even my nutritional, like I think relatively, most people eat healthy, but think of it as you're always getting a little better, and a little better. And if you're making progress, then you're going to get really far over the course of your life, really. That's what we're all about, is we want to maximize our time that we have.
I think there is a level of, quote, perfection, and then that has wiggle room and enjoyment. Mm-hmm. That is the perfect diet, where you're eating mostly healthy, but you have some relaxation. You eat the foods that you like. If you like chocolate, you eat chocolate. If you like some alcohol, you drink alcohol. But it's in moderation.
Yeah.
And you have a majority of healthy foods, and you're fueling for performance. And then that's pretty much, you don't need to have the stress of. We talk a lot about constant improvement, but like, I need a GABA brown rice instead of brown rice to like change this. And, I can cook this, and I've fallen in that trap many, many times, but it's the extra mental energy is not worth it to go that far. And it will actually probably do harm long-term.
That perfection that you're talking about, Nate, doesn't mean that it's static though, right? Like, it still evolves, it still changes. Mm-hmm. It's still, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at, Pete, is the fact that like, there's no like defined plane where basically you've reached here and it's perfect and that's it. But instead, like you said, Nate, it's about finding balance and health and comfort and sustainability with this sort of a thing. It's like the hardest part for me is habit with all of this, and taste buds are tied into that, and food is extremely emotional as well. So I think like Amber's point of understanding what you're actually doing and not feeling, man, it's so easy to feel guilty about this too, because it's like, why is it so easy for everybody else? Because on Instagram, everyone's food looks amazing, right? Like, and everyone's diet is just perfect, because I go on the internet and I look and I have so many people telling me what to eat. So I must be the only one, and you're not. And the person writing that is not perfect. Nobody is. Like, it takes a lot of time and constant work to be able to change this around. And in particular, when you talk about anything that's restrictive, it really it introduces constraints, which then inspires creativity many times, and you have to kind of get around it in a lot of ways. But particularly if you are going for something like a vegan diet, which I think, especially like, if for ethical reasons, whatever else the reasons are, it's awesome. When you do that sort of a thing, it's also really tempting, especially with that one, because it's a lot harder to get a lot of sources of food that you can bring in like that. Be really patient with yourself. Like, it's going to take a long time and a bunch of habit changing to get to the point where you can like front load everything enough to have food sources that you can, really vary like this. Pete's been at this game for quite some time. He has a degree in nutrition and he's still learning how to do it. So it takes time for sure.
I want to say something about Cinnabons because I looked it up.
Yeah.
A regular Cinnabon, 880 calories, 37 grams of fat, 127 grams of carbs. That's actually less fat than I thought. Then you get a pecan one because of the nuts. It's 51 grams of fat, 146 grams of carbs.
Is that 880 calories for a Cinnabon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Holy.
they're
So good.
They're
I know, so
they smell so good, right?
that's actually like
It
that might
tastes
be
really good too.
a pre or post race thing for me because that's not so bad and like that makes me super happy and
Yeah.
I did something awesome. So like that's a good nice reward for myself.
Going through the airport, they just smell so good.
I heard a dietitian say, which is so interesting, is it was facetious, but they said, "Hey, name a fattening food," and it's the idea that there's no such thing as a fattening food. There's caloric surplus or caloric deficit. You can gain weight on all vegetables. That'd be very hard to do, or you could give Tour de France riders one Cinnabon a day, and they would all lose a ton of weight, right? Because it wouldn't be enough calorically. So you can eat some of these foods and not necessarily say, oh, if I eat a Cinnabon, it's just going to go to my stomach or my hips, and I'm going to get really fat all of a sudden because it's a air quote fattening food. You pull it in, you do a big ride, you have a Cinnabon, it makes you feel good. You're not going to, you could actually lose weight that day and lose fat. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Yep. Don't beat yourself up.